So I'm going to read from my kind of new novel. It's a novel about Iran's most famous woman poet. Her name was Furugh, and she was born in 1935 and died in 1967. My novel is her story, but told as a fiction. Did I mess things up by touching these? It's wet. Oh, that's why it's buried. So all you need to know is that it's 1950 in Tehran, Iran, and Furugh is 15 years old. The first lines that I'll read are actually translations of her poems. There's a street where the boys who were once in love with me, the boys with tousled hair and lanky legs, still think about the innocent girl who was carried away by the wind one night. It was the end of my girlhood, but I didn't know it yet. If I realized what would happen there, would I have followed my mother into that room in the bottom of the city? If I'd guessed the purpose of our visit, would I have turned to run before my mother struck the brass knocker against the door? I doubt it. I was 16 years old and by anyone's account already a troublemaker. But in those moments that my sister and I stood under the clear blue sky of Tehran's winter, I understood nothing about what would soon happen to me, and I was much too frightened to break free. We made a tight fit in the carriage, pressed together in the back seat. My mother drew her veil across her face, then leaned forward to speak to the driver. He looked at her. "Are you sure you want to go there?" I heard him say, and he looked very uncomfortable. "Begging your pardon, madam, but it's no place for ladies such as yourself." My mother said something I couldn't hear. The driver tightened his necktie with one hand, took up his whip with the other, and with that the horse lurched into the street. "Where are we going?" I whispered, nudging my sister gently a few times, but she wouldn't look at me. She just sank further back into her seat, staring miserably at our hands. The wheels of the carriage creaked and groaned until all the landmarks of the city disappeared and nothing was familiar to me. After maybe another mile or so, we eventually passed a railway station. Here, the sharp clap of hooves against the concrete gave way to the soft, packed dirt, which was how I knew we were now in the southern section of the city's poorest district. At the doors of a mosque, mothers stood with their children strapped to their chests, begging for alms as their children played at their skirts. Men slumped along the walls of houses while older children milled about barefoot in the streets. Beggars, puddles, rubbish, stray dogs. I couldn't tear my eyes from any of it. As I stepped from the coach and into the lane, a strange odor assailed me, a mixture of mud, manure, smoke, and all at once I felt clammy and weak-kneed, and I reached for my sister's elbow to steady myself. From an end of the alley came the sharp barking of dogs, and black plumes rose from the rooftop, smudging the bright January sky. I followed my mother and sister a few paces, then stopped and planted my hands on my waist. "Why are we here? Where are we going?" "It's a clinic," my mother answered. She spoke quietly, and now she too was avoiding my eyes. "For God's sake, just hurry up." The vestibule inside was full of women. They stood in pairs and in groups, older women and several very young ones, from one end of the wall to the other. They waited with their heads tipped down, biting their lips and staring at the floor. Nobody spoke. A worn, faded carpet had been strung up from the ceiling and as a makeshift partition between the vestibule and the rest of the building. After a few minutes, a girl of 16 or 17 drew back the carpet and led us down the corridor and into a cramped chamber lit by two small kerosene lamps. The air inside was laced with a strong, bitter scent. Ammonia, I guessed. I squinted, scanned the room. There was a square window set high up in the wall and barred with a metal grate. Against one wall stood a table draped with a white cotton sheet. I glimpsed at the wash basin in the farthest corner. It was etched with brown lines. The walls were bare, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that on one side of the room a crack reached up from the floor to the ceiling in a single long, jagged line. I looked at my sister, but she still wouldn't meet my eyes. Was it then, in that moment, that I began to understand why we had come to this place, or rather, why I had been brought here? Maybe, but by this time it was already too late. The door opened and a stout older woman entered. She had a sharp chin and she wore her hair parted in the middle and pulled into a low bun. She shut the door, issued a quick greeting, and looked from me to my sister and then to our mother. Which one? My mother nodded in my direction. I watched as my mother and sister were ushered away. The younger woman had stayed behind, standing with her arms clasped in front of her. Sit, the older woman ordered once they'd left, motioning toward the table. Take off your underpants and then lie down, she said. With my mother and sister gone, her voice was suddenly much harsher. My underpants? She nodded. I shook my head. I won't. The two women exchanged a look. That look, I'd never forget it, or my own fear in witnessing it. I tried to stand, but before my feet had reached the ground, the younger woman had already stepped forward. She was slight, slender as a reed, but her grip was astonishingly strong. She shoved me backward, and in what felt like a practiced gesture, jerked my legs up onto the table, dug her elbow into my chest, and cupped her hand firmly over my mouth. Lie still, the older woman told me. She pushed up her sleeves and drew in a deep breath, yanked my underpants down to my ankles, and then placed one hand on each of my knees to force my legs open. Whatever else I forget about these next minutes, or only pretend to forget, I can tell you I fought her, and hard. I pushed myself up onto my elbows and kicked my legs, but the younger girl only bore deeper into my chest with one elbow and cupped a hand over my mouth to stifle my screams. And the older one held me by the ankles. Lie still, they told me, this time together. Working quickly, the older woman forced my legs apart again, thrust two fingers inside me, hooked them in the shape of a C. I jerked my legs back and kicked her, this time much harder, and then that's when it happened. In that instant, when I tried to free myself, all of a sudden I felt a tearing pain, quick and deep, and I sucked in my breath. The woman drew her fingers from me and wiped them briskly with a cloth. Something gave her pause. A deep crease sprang up between her eyes. You're a stupid girl, she said, looking into my eyes for the first time since she'd entered the room. I told you to lie still, but you wouldn't. And now see what you've done. And that's it. Thank you.